Well, here we go. I know this always takes a moment. Ah, there I am. Okay, quick check. Who can hear me? Who can see me? How is the picture looking? Is it smooth? Is it choppy? Hi, Scott. Yes, there is sound. At least I can hear myself talking. But then I'm in the room with me, so that would make sense. Boy, there is a lot of lag on this. So, unless I get messages saying that there is something wrong, I am going to assume that at least there is something nearly right. And yeah, I'm dealing with a bandwidth issue where I'm shooting from, so hopefully that's going to get fixed sometime in the near future. Okay, so the subject of tonight's discussion is questions. I don't know if you've noticed, but this is something that I picked up on a while back and has so far been pretty much true across the board. Every teacher that I've run across I consider to be real. Not just one of the hucksters in the spiritual marketplace, but actually somebody who has walked the walk and done the work and come out the other end, has got one thing in common. And that is that every one of them have had they could boil down their work into one burning question. And that is what drove them through the entire process of their work. For instance, Ramana Maharishi. Everybody agrees that he was a real enlightened guy, and he had lots and lots of people following him around for his wisdom and stuff. And he definitely seems to be somebody who knew what was going on. And for him, the question that drove him, that burned him to the point where he could not let it go and had to find the answer was, who am I? And then he worked at that question until he got to the most fundamental answer that could possibly be reached. And that was it. That was the end of his journey. Then he turned around and told everybody else, go sit down. Ask yourself, who am I? Until there are no more answers. And what is this? Hopefully, this is all coming through to you. Do feel free, of course, to post questions at any time. I have Kyle monitoring them, so if she sees something that I need to address, she will. When you talk about Steve, are you talking about Steve Barnes? This is for Scott, who said, Steve has two questions, who am I and what is true? Which I guess are the same. The same could be interpreted as the same question. Or are you talking about Steve Gray? That's another one of the enlightened folks out there. A guy by the name of Adyashanti lives here in California. Down, at least the last I heard, he was down around Los Gatos or Cupertino or someplace like that. And his driving question was always, what is true? What is the truth? What is the most fundamental truth I can get to? And then, of course, there's Descartes. Descartes in the West was the guy who really started that out with his, what can I know to be true? And he came up with his cogito ergo sum, which people usually translate as I think, therefore I am, but that's a lousy translation of what he was trying to say. He said it in French first, then they translated it to Latin, then back into English. And what he was saying is that the one thing that I find that I cannot doubt is my own awareness looking at all of this stuff. So that's the ultimate cogito. And so this seems to be something that, I mean, I can go through one teacher after another, like Byron Katie. She has 4 questions. She's somebody else who I consider to be the real deal. But her 4 questions all boil down to one question as well. And it definitely seemed to have driven her to the point where she got to where she was. So what happens inevitably is when one of these folks gets to the end of their quest and they find the answer to their question, they assume that their question will work for everybody else. In my experience, this is not necessarily true. For instance, the Ramana thing would never work for me because I don't wonder who I am. I have no doubt who I am. But that is my particular makeup, so something else would have to work for me. And some people have no driving questions. Yes, Scott, you have to remember at the time that Descartes wrote, not appealing to God and keeping the church happy had much more dire consequences than it does today. So there is always that. Now, I want to juxtapose this with something else. Years and years ago, I used to knock around with this Mevlevi Sheikh, who was quite the teacher back in the 70s and 80s here in the States and elsewhere. And he was definitely an interesting guy and had a lot of interesting things to say. And one of the things that he said that stuck with me for all of these decades since was that he used to say, "What is today's question?" And he would say, don't try and answer it. Sit with the question. The question is more important than the answer. The answer is contained within the question, which I have inevitably, almost always found to be true. Usually when somebody in these situations asks a question, they already know what they think the answer should be. And usually whatever they think the answer should be is wrong. And you have to dig down a little bit deeper. So, here's a question for everybody who is watching this. What is your most important question right now? What is the question that, if you could find the answer to it, would change your life? Think about it. Write down something in the comments. If you don't know, write down that you don't know. And I'm going to sit here patiently until I see a comment or two. I might tell you silly stories or something, but until I get a little feedback, I'm not sure which direction to take this. So it's very warm where I'm sitting here, though it's been cooler today than it has been lately in this, I think of it as the antechamber to hell. And it only got up to the low 90s today, which is not bad. I'm still not seeing any questions there, but I don't know if that means... Yeah. So this idea of questions seems to... somebody... Yeah, will I ever get a full night's... The answer is probably not. Now that is an interesting question. It's one that I have not run across too terribly often. Ilmar says, what is my true relationship to the world I experience? Okay. I knew somebody was going to ask that. Ian Cox asks, what questions have you personally found most useful? I can tell you what question works for me, and there's only one, but bear in mind that it's my question. It might not be your question. It's a good question when it comes down to it. I found it to be a very useful question, and that is, am I awake or am I asleep? The useful thing about this question is that the moment that you ask it, you actually wake up for a moment. And this is actually a question that my teacher used to use on me until he got me hooked on it. And he pointed out that merely by looking inside to see whether you are awake or asleep and dreaming, you wake up for a moment, if you're in fact awake. Or if you're in the dream state, you wake up in the dream state, which is equally fun. So that question is a trick. And it's a good trick. Try it out. Ask yourself right now, am I awake or am I asleep? And how would I know the difference? You do know the difference. Just like you know the difference when you wake up out of a dream, that was a dream and this is the waking world. If you give yourself that moment of actual awakeness, then you know what you're shooting for. And you can keep doing that over and over again until you can begin to hold that state. After a while, you can hold that state for quite some time. And of course, if you pursue that kind of question, eventually the theory is that you will remain in the waking state longer and longer until such time as that becomes your natural abiding state. Excuse me. Back in the 70s, there were groups of people who were Ramana followers who did what they called enlightenment intensives, which basically you gave them a lot of money and they set you in a room and had you face somebody else who gave them a lot of money and ask each other, who are you? Over and over and over again for like a long weekend. And interestingly, as enlightening somebody, this process really didn't work. It was pretty much a failure across the board. Anybody know why? So, the answer, as far as I can tell, is that most people really didn't care about that question. And it became just sort of a game. So you could go, yeah, I went through the Enlightenment Intensive, got a lot out of it, got some serious realizations, and then they would go on with their lives. So the thing about the question is that the answer to the question has to matter. You have to really want to know. You have to be willing to sell everything you have and jump on a camel and go riding off into the desert to find the answer to this question, if that's what it takes. That's the kind of question you need. This is me. I don't know if you can see it, looking at my little tablet here where I can read people's comments, which is why I keep looking down. Yeah, I think that it wouldn't matter, Scott, if you were asking somebody else or you were asking yourself. Yes, Ian, like all of that. There is nothing that human beings have done to wake themselves up that other human beings haven't done to put themselves to sleep. I'm pretty sure there's a natural law involved in that somewhere. So when I think about it, I'm pretty sure that there is a force in the universe that acts to keep people snoozing away. I tend to think of it as the goddess Maya, if you know your Hindu pantheon. Maya is the goddess of illusion. And she likes to keep people wrapped up in their illusions. And in order for the universe, or the world at least, to function in the way that it is, she's the most important goddess out there. And, she will have her due. This, of course, is all metaphor. I don't think of her as a being, though I think there is a force that can be modeled as that. Yes, that's exactly right, Ian. That is why the question needs to be individualized and why one mantra doesn't work for anyone or everyone. Actually, most mantras don't work at all unless you're really into going into low-grade trances, because that's what most mantra chanting produces. So, It's another way to be entertained. One of the mottos of the school is that we are a place for people who would rather be awake than entertained. And being awake is uncomfortable. Being entertained is fun. I mean, if our entire social culture is built around being entertained, people spend time on Facebook to be entertained. They go to the movies to be entertained. They watch television to be entertained. They read books to be entertained. And it's all about that. And the feeling of not being entertained is usually constituted as boredom. And we have come to fear that feeling to the point where we will do anything not to have it. Scott asks, if I don't have that kind of question, and the fact that I am not in the desert somewhere is indicative of that, then what? And the answer is, then you go on with your life. If there is a question for you, let it come up. If there isn't, then find another vehicle. I'm assuming because you are here and listening to this, you are actually somewhere with at least both feet on the path. Because people who are totally into just being entertained, they get bored and wander off with talks like this. So that you're here and that you keep coming back speaks to either a loss of sanity on your part, or you are already working in some way. If you're working in some way, more than likely there will be a question in there somewhere, though it may not be impelling at this point. There might be other things that speak more deeply to you. And that's okay. One thing that we know is that the path is not one size fits all. It's one size fits one, literally. Anybody who knows the history of Gurdjieff knows that his prime student was a Russian mathematician by the name of Peter Ouspensky. And they had this big breakup. It was terrible. It was like the worst divorce you have ever seen in anywhere on TV. And it was around the fact that Gurdjieff was not consistent. Ouspensky, being a mathematician, wanted a system. He wanted to know, what are the steps to awakening? Step 1 is this. Step 2 is that. Step 3 is this other thing. That's what he wanted, and that's what he did not get. Mr. Gurdjieff would give one practice to one person and give an entirely opposite instruction to somebody else. And this drove Ouspensky crazy. But the fact of the matter is that it has to be individualized for each person. And this is one of the ways that you know that you have a decent teacher, is that they don't try and teach the same lesson to everybody who walks through their door. They will look at what the person needs, and then look at what the person wants. And then they'll throw away what the person wants, because what the person wants almost inevitably is in the way of what they need. And they will arrange for that person to have an opportunity to get what they need. At least in my experience, that's how it works. I like to quote the Fremen, Ian, which is, God created the desert to test the faithful. Or it was actually God created Dune to test the faithful, but same thing. And I believe that's true. Of course, I grew up in the desert, so I'm I have a fondness for it. So that was my thought, and this originated out of the whole "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" conversation that happened on the forum a few days back. And don't ask me how I got here from there, but somehow the connection was made in my mind that was what we wanted. So there is a question. There is no system. There's a meta system, perhaps. There is one of the things that I have seen is that the teachers that I came up working with would use the Enneagram as a method of determining what each individual student needed. They would have that process in their head to the point where on the fly they could say, okay, you need this shock to get through this point. And this is for you and this is not for anybody else. Go do this. An example of that is my first teacher sent me to train with the Mevlevis for just about 2 years. He had me working with them. And that's because he felt that their process had something that would be beneficial to me. I don't know of any of his other students that he sent to the Mevlevis, though he had sent some to other places as part of their training. So this is the kind of thing that that's a very good question, but it is a question. Where does the light come from that illuminates our dreams? It is exactly the same answer to that as the question, who is the Buddha that makes the grass green? So think about that. Or don't, as the case may be. I always appreciate the Zen guys and their questions and answers. The nicest thing, though, is if you're a Zen teacher and you ask your student a question, no matter what their answer is, you get to hit them with a stick. And I find that sometimes that's beneficial. But I'm not a Zen guy. So what can you do? So what else do we know? What do we think? What do we question? I am here to amuse and entertain you for the next half hour, and I can ramble on as necessary, but I would be happy to focus myself according to your desires. And I'm happy to just sit here and stare into the screen. So, while we're waiting, let me tell you. As most of you know, I like Mullah Nasruddin stories. Why play the game? That's a good question. Why not play the game? You got anything better to do? It's the only game that there is. So you either play it or you don't play it. Not playing the game is called nirvana. Do you know what nirvana means in Sanskrit? Anybody? Care to take a guess? I am looking here. Hopefully you're all running to the internet to find a Sanskrit English dictionary. And you're going to look up nirvana in that dictionary. Or you actually know the answer. No guesses? And why accept responsibility? Why not accept responsibility? Again, do you have anything better to do? Yes, not playing the game is a strategy. There is no not playing the game on this level of reality. Yes, Kyle, it means blown out, as a candle is blown out. It means extinction. So, to enter nirvana is to be blown out. It is to have whatever constitutes the you of you reabsorbed. The drop becomes the ocean. Whatever individuality you have is gone. There is no you. So, that's your choice. You either play the game or you allow yourself to be extinguished. And extinguished doesn't mean dead, because even dead is playing the game. If you go for the reincarnation thing, then, you're going to come back as a newt or something. Yes, I have bandwidth issues. You would think, being out west, that I would have better access to bandwidth, but that is not actually always the case. I am hoping to get better bandwidth in the near future. Until then, we do as best we can. I'm also experimenting with other formats that we might be using in the future to be able to talk to each other. Some of them I'm still figuring out what and how to use. One of the most interesting that might be a way to produce a good space for talks is a program and server system called Discord, which was developed originally for games, but is now used for all manner of different interesting things. More on that as we go. Yeah, Ian has a few more nodes to go through than you do, because he's out in Georgia, and you're just down the block. That was to Kyle. Don't know if that makes any difference. So, and there's Craig Gray. Hey, Craig, how are you doing? And Tony. So, where was I? Yeah, blown out is, this is to Scott, blown out is a more accurate definition than quenching, because quenching involves dumping something in something else as opposed to just being extinguished, turned off. But the image that you want is a breath blowing out a candle. So Craig there is one of the people who one day I want to interview as soon as we get that set up. He is a very interesting guy and does amazingly good programs. And he's not paying me to say this, just so you know. But he's doing some things that actually have value in the world, more so than watching the Kardashians be in catfights and things like that. No, I am definitely not getting your responses very quickly, and that's partly because I have to stare down at my little tablet to see the messages when they come up, and because there's a huge lag between what I'm saying in the room that I'm sitting in and what you are hearing on Facebook. Probably close to 20 seconds as far as I can tell right now, which is a heck of a long time on the interwebs. So Ian asks, so is a good teacher someone who not only has a good question, but also can also induce a question in others? That's part of what a good teacher can do. A teacher doesn't get to be a teacher until they have worked through their own question, in whatever way that looks like for whatever school they're coming out of. And I should say something about schools. People, the schools that I know are mostly Sufi schools. That's where I have spent the majority of my life. And people who are not inside of them often ask, well, what is the difference between what you guys believe and what these other guys believe? And I would look at them and say, there's no difference. There's no belief going on here. We have no doctrinal things that we're trying to argue with. And they would look at me very, very weird, because here in the West, we are most familiar with like Christian sects who are always fighting about the minutiae of what is true within their doctrine. A Sufi tarika means a path, is a school. And it's a school where you learn the trade that you are most drawn to, that you have the most resonance with. So if you had the vocation of a plumber, you wouldn't go to a carpentry school. Even though the carpentry school might be the best carpentry school in the world, it would not be the school for you. If you were a weaver, you wouldn't go to a painting school. You wouldn't go anywhere to learn how to paint, because you wanted to learn how to weave. And that's what you should find in real schools. In real schools, they are designed, that the teaching that they have is designed for a particular kind of person. Thank you, Kyle. Kyle is going along and helping with definitions as we go. So you're hearing the dogs barking in the backyard. I should go beat them, but I haven't got the heart for it, because every time I'm thinking, I should take a club to that mutt, she gives me these big, weird colored eyes and a super huge grin, and I just kind of get all melty and go, oh. So you're just going to have to put up with the barking. So anyway, the quality of a real teacher is that they teach a discipline that worked for them to the people for whom that discipline will work. And this is something that you'll see, at least amongst Sufis, is somebody will come in and they go, oh, I want to study with you. Oh, great sheikh. And the teacher will look at them and go, no, you're not one of mine. You can hang out here until you figure out where you're supposed to be, but you're not one of mine, so I can't really teach you other than to care for you until you find where you actually belong. And that is nearly unique in my experience. And I've seen that over and over again in the last way too long, very, very long time. So, schools are not one size fits all. Questions are not one size fits all. And the kind of question you have will probably determine the kind of school you will want to find. Just a thought. Later on, I'm going to talk about how you can know if the teacher of the school is the real teacher. I'm probably going to put that up on YouTube because I need to put up something on YouTube. I've been way too lazy about my YouTube channel. So, all right, more questions. If you don't have any questions, I'll settle for an answer. Give me an answer. I want an answer. And if you say 46, you lose. Or 42 for that matter. Or any number. Well, there went a thumbs up. That's something of an answer. Ah. 42. You lose. Hi, Tony. As far as I can tell, Aaron asks, should there be many ways to find your question or just the right one? As far as I can tell, there are as many ways to find the question as there are the question. The only thing that I can say that is the right way is that the question will drive you. It's something that won't let you go. It will shoot you like an arrow. Yeah, Scott, that was an eye-opener for me the first time I experienced that. That the teacher will know a real teacher will know who is theirs and who isn't. And that's a very important thing. Nick, the question that we are attempting to answer is the question that drives us. For instance, we talked about Descartes a little bit earlier, his cogito, his, what can I know is true was his question, basically. And that was a question that drove him enough that he actually, hunted down the answer in a way that made final and ultimate sense. And the cogito, when you understand it, is a totally Zen answer. So, how about them Dodgers? So I'm sitting here. I'm just waiting for my next inspiration. Kyle says, did we touch on Caesar's question above? What are the different courses available to different students at such a school? I did miss that. Thanks for catching it for me. That will depend on the school. For instance, the Mevlevis, their main practice revolves around their what's called the sama. Sama literally means listening, to listen to something. And that's where they do why they got the name the whirling dervishes, because the sama involves a bunch of people spinning about to very specialized music for quite some time. The entire ceremony goes on for a bit over an hour. So that is what you get there, is you learn how to turn. And their turn is very interesting because it's not the ecstatic going into bliss thing that everybody thinks it is. It's incredibly controlled, and you don't get dizzy, and you don't get blissful, not in the sense that we tend to think of it. You just become a clear channel while you're doing this, and you turn for, they call it the four salams, the four chapters of the story, as it were. Scott asks, will I be discussing my process of walking soon? The answer to that is yes, as soon as I can figure out how to discuss it in a way that makes sense, which will probably have to be in a series of videos where I can demonstrate, which means I will have to find somebody who can operate the camera for me. In short, it is a process of what I think of as the most natural walking. And I should say, let me tell you a story. When I was a young lad, probably 10 years old, I was walking through a dry wash with my grandfather. And my grandfather looked down at the ground and he said, grandson, a white man has walked through here within the last few hours. And I looked at him and I said, grandfather, how can you tell that was a white man? And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, white men walk like ducks. And he pointed out the tracks to me, and sure enough, they were way turned out. And he said, white people, when they have their pressure releases, first they step way far forward. And the first point on the Enneagram. Yes, the question is the first point on the Enneagram. Ian, clear channel for what? That would be telling. So, anyway, he pointed out to me that this was out in southeastern New Mexico on the Mescalero Reservation, which is kind of up in the mountains behind Roswell. And he pointed out that different peoples walk in different ways. The white man walks by shoving his feet way far forward, burying his heel into the ground, stalling his body out, and then creating massive pressure releases when he steps forward. He pointed out that, at least at this time, and this was back in the early 50s, native peoples walked where their pressure came almost straight down with the weight on almost the whole foot. And so the pressure release was very, very light, and their feet pointed forward in the direction they were going. I have found that this was true, and I spent literally the rest of my life watching how people walk. Everywhere I went, I would watch how people walk. And it was very telling. In Europe, you have the same thing as in America. People tend to walk in an almost violent way, certainly violent to their bodies. When I was living in East Africa, people walked totally differently, and how their muscles engaged totally differently. Americans walk using their quadriceps. Africans walk using their glutes as the main source of propulsion. I think a good portion of this is that most people in East Africa, and by East Africa I'm referring to Tanzania and Kenya specifically, because that's where I spent the most time, tend to wear either very unstructured shoes or no shoes at all. So this was something that I really have always paid attention to. And in talking about walking as a practice, you know you're doing it right when you feel like you're gliding, when there is no crashing into the ground with your forward step, and when it is effortless. And to talk about it is one thing. To do it is something totally different. I can give you a practice, which is stand with both feet together, take one foot and raise your knee high enough so only the ball of your foot is touching, and then relax your foot and let your foot swing forward. Use the supporting foot to push yourself forward, and allow your weight to come straight, the center of mass, center of weight to come down directly over the moving foot as it touches the ground. Yes, high heels are one of the worst things that have ever been Yeah, the runway walk is a whole different thing. The runway walk is actually good for fighting when you're moving in a sparring match. But that's a different thing too, because you tend to be up on the balls of your feet. What are we doing here? As usual, we have wandered all over the place, which is kind of what I like to do. I hope I answered a little bit about the walking, and my plan is to actually put together an instructional on everything that I mentioned in that paper. I'm working on some of the dietary stuff now. Now, the stick is not used as part of the walking practice per se, though there are some interesting things that one can do with it while walking. Walking with something in your hand is interesting. The stick is part of the exercise practice. And again, I'm going to have to do some videoing with that. And again, I have to find somebody to be on the backside of the camera, because if I'm demonstrating it, I'm going to be moving around just a little bit. So, yes, we are going to talk about the use of the stick. We are going to talk about walking. We're going to talk about diet. We're going to talk about all of these things, breath work, in its own time, as people are interested. You know, I'm basically making a guess that this is something that people are going to be interested in. I could be totally wrong. We'll see. I don't think that I am. I think that this is an idea whose time has come. And I'm hoping that it will work out well. Oh my God, Ruth! Hello, Ruth! How are things out in Hawaii? How is that volcano doing out there? Now, Ruth is somebody who I have known since the late 90s. Has it been that long, Ruth? Back in the old Sufi studies list, I think was the first time I ran across you. So, good. Well, we have one person who's interested, and I know my what do you call them? My inner students are all interested. And so that might be enough people to be interested. We'll see. But I need to be nagged more about this so that I will be reminded to do what I'm doing. And that will help me to figure out which order to do it in. What are people most interested in? So you might want to, if you're interested in any of it, you might want to go back to that essay on the 9-sided circle page and read over it again and look at the stuff that I talked about and ask yourself, what would I like to learn first? And then let me know. And there's Laura. So, it is getting on towards 9:58. Thank you, Scott. Keep that up. So, we have 2 minutes left. What are the questions that you might have that are pressing? What is your question for the night? Okay, things are moving along there. So, I want to thank you all again for putting up with me. Hopefully this has been, if nothing else, entertaining. Because if all you get is a laugh, that ain't so bad. And hopefully a little bit more than entertaining. I would like to think that I have instilled 1 or 2 new thoughts into you. And so, from the gateway to the bowels of hell, here I will bid you adieu for the evening. And I will be back again next Sunday with something hopefully to catch your interests and